I'm Father Columba Stewart, Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or as we call it, HIML. HIML is an international organization based out of Minnesota in the United States. Our work is solely funded by donations and grants. Our purpose is to preserve and share the world's handwritten past, to inspire a deeper understanding of our present and future. Handwritten books, manuscripts, are clues documenting what humans over thousands of years thought important enough to share. It is incredible what these voices from the past have to tell and teach us. Therefore, we photograph manuscripts around the world, so their contents can be available for centuries to come. We place a special priority on manuscripts located in regions endangered by war, political instability, or other threats. Preservation begins through partnerships with local libraries, agreements that allow HIML to make digital images of the manuscripts in their collections. Digitization is done entirely through local teams to whom we provide equipment, training, technical support, and payment for their work. We photograph everything in a collection because we don't know what might be significant in the future. Copies of the digital images are given to the repository that holds the manuscripts. Another copy comes to HIML in Minnesota. HIML employs catalogers and other staff to ensure that the digital images of these manuscripts are identified, supported for long-term access, and are made freely available to the public via our website. One of the many advantages that comes with doing the work that we do is that my team and I meet with extraordinary people from every corner of the world. We learn about their culture, their present experiences, and how they see the future. This series gives me the opportunity to introduce these extraordinary people and their stories to all of you, as well as to ask them questions I never had the chance to ask before. It is my belief, and it has been proven again and again throughout history, that when we truly listen to what others have to tell us, we build an understanding, and that is always a good foundation for collaboration. And of course, manuscripts and our written human knowledge are always at the heart of these encounters. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this journey to listen. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the second episode of HIML's To Listen series. This series of interviews was prompted by my comment at the 2019 Jefferson Lecture in the Humanities that we are at great risk of losing the capacity to listen, and therefore losing our ability to understand. The ultimate goal of HIML's work of manuscript preservation and access is understanding. The study of these manuscripts means listening to the voices of the past and learning from them. I'm delighted to welcome as our guest today, Metropolitan Archbishop Borys Gudziak of the Ukrainian Catholic Archeparchy of Philadelphia. We'll ask him to decode that title in just a moment. I first met Archbishop Borys in Washington in 2006, where we had a dinner to discuss possible manuscript digitization projects in Ukraine. At that time, he was rector of Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, or Lviv, as most Americans would pronounce it, Ukraine. I visited Lviv later that year with our mutual friend, Father Peter Galadza, and was happy to cross paths with Archbishop Borys during my later visits to Lviv. Archbishop Borys was born in Syracuse, New York, to Ukrainian parents who came to the United States in the 1950s. He studied at Syracuse University, at church-related institutions in Rome, and at Harvard University, where he received his PhD in 1992. That dissertation, later published, was about the origins of the Ukrainian Catholic Church as an Eastern Christian, Byzantine Rite church in communion with Rome. The support of Archbishop Borys and the Ukrainian Catholic University were crucial for the success of Himmel's several projects in Lviv, where we continue to be active in manuscript digitization. So, Borys, welcome. Great to see you.
Columba, thank you. And, I just want to salute you and your whole team for what you are doing around the world, but particularly in Ukraine.
Well, much appreciated. It's been a great pleasure. And my time in Ukraine and the work we've done there has been such a journey of discovery. And I hope we'll be able to unpack some of that in our conversation today. So why don't we begin by, as I promised, decoding your title a bit. What does a metropolitan mean? And what is an eparchy?
Okay. So an eparchy is equivalent to a diocese. It's a synonym. It's the same thing. So that should be simple. An archeparchy is an archdiocese. And in the Eastern Catholic churches, like in the Western Catholic churches, a few dioceses constitute a province that is headed by an archbishop. And in the Eastern tradition, the Metropolitans have a little bit more, I think, jurisdiction, or there's more cohesive activity expected in a province according to canon law. Our Metropolitanate is part of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, as it's officially called, Eastern Catholic Church. It's one of the 23 Eastern Catholic churches in the Catholic Communion. And there are 18 dioceses in Ukraine and 19 dioceses outside of Ukraine, which is quite amazing because in 1900, there were only 3 dioceses in Ukraine with 3 bishops. Now there are 37 dioceses and 52 bishops, which is a result of the emigration and the persecution in Ukraine, which forced millions of people, millions of Eastern Catholics to leave the country over the last century and a half.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about some of that history because it's certainly salient for the story of your church. And of course, your parents were in one of those waves of immigration. Could you say a little bit about where they came from and when and why?
My parents were from Western Ukraine. That part of Ukraine before independence was between World War I and World War II under Poland. It was part of Poland. Before World War I, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then during World War II, it was occupied by the Soviets once, then by the Nazis. And when the Soviets were coming a second time, my parents, as 18-year-olds, left in different ways. They did not know each other. They met in New York City 6 years later. They were DPs. We saw Syrian refugees in Europe. That was the plight of these displaced persons in 1944, 1945, late 40s. And they came in 1949 and 1950 separately to New York City, where they met at the Ukrainian Catholic Church, St. George's, on the Lower East Side. And within half a year, they were married. My father then had to redo his dental studies, which he had done in the late 40s in Germany. He was very quickly drafted into the American Army, ended up serving in Germany for a few years. And then my parents settled in Syracuse, New York, where I was born.
So I have the impression that unlike some American immigrant traditions, in yours, you actually learned Ukrainian. The home was very much a Ukrainian home.
It was. I didn't know, I couldn't speak English fluently until, I finished the kindergarten. I learned it in kindergarten, probably in a matter of a month or two, because a child absorbs things easily. So yes, we were completely bilingual. Ultimately, I ended up living in Europe for 30 years in many different countries, chunks of time in many countries. So apparently now I have an accent in every language I speak. But every day I end up using about 5 languages. in the work that I do, just the pastoral work, and not speaking scholarly work.
So I wanted to ask you about that fact you just mentioned, and you said in our conversation before we started the formal interview, that you spent 30 years outside the United States, although you were born here, and that's about half your life. So was there a formative encounter or experience that led you to go first to Rome and begin this extraordinary journey that you've been on?
Indeed, there was. The Ukrainian Catholic Church was liquidated as a visible structure by Stalin in 1946. All the bishops were arrested in 1945, and he forced 216 priests at gunpoint to say, we cut our ties with Rome and we're joining the Russian Orthodox Church. These were 216 out of 3,000 priests, more or less. Many of the priests were imprisoned along with the bishops. And this head of the church, Joseph Sztitsky, spent 18 years in the Gulag system in Siberian exile. In 1963, he was released as a gesture of gratitude by the head of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, a gesture of gratitude to John the 23rd, who intervened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Pope asked Khrushchev to allow Joseph Sztitsky, who was crippled, to attend Vatican II, the second session. Sztitsky made it out. He recovered physically and lived another 20 years until 1984. But in 1968, he came to Syracuse, and I was chosen as a young boy to greet him at the airport as a 7-year-old. And that was the first encounter, which led to more encounters as I was a teenager. And when I felt a vocation to the priesthood, I was attracted by his magnetic personality and his incredible witness of fortitude. He confronted the biggest challenge of the 20th century, totalitarianism, and made it out. So I went to study and live with him in Rome. And since he was the exile head of the church, he signed me up for his archdiocese in Ukraine. So I was a seminarian for a Archeparchy in Ukraine, Lviv, actually, where the university is. And he told us to prepare to work there sometime. Outside observers thought that was like, preparing to work on a diocese on Mars, because we couldn't get there.
You had not even been to Ukraine at that point.
I had made a visit on one of these official Soviet tours where we were, taken around and shown kindergartens with children who gave us flowers, things like that. But in the 80s, I couldn't get a visa. That was 78 the first time I went. I didn't get a visa until 88. But we were too young not to believe Sztitsky. He was a hero. He was greater than life. There were only a few of us, 11 when I arrived in Rome. He set up a prototype of the Ukrainian Catholic University. He just declared it in Rome, built a building and started publications. And this scholarly interest, this deep, let's say, understanding of tradition, along with the heroic witness and his charismatic personality, mobilized the whole church, actually, our whole Ukrainian Catholic Church, and a few of us became his disciples.
And so in a sense, you were ready. There was a kind of church in waiting outside Ukraine when it became possible. Could you tell us briefly the story of the reemergence of the church in Ukraine? Because I remember hearing that from you and others, and it was such a moving story.
It's really hard to fathom, for somebody who didn't experience it, what totalitarianism is. I find that now in Ukraine, I have to explain this to the young students, because Soviet history for them is the past. It's like Rome. It's like, the medieval period. They don't fully understand it. The 20th century saw the first experiment in trying to totally control a human being. Not only actions, but even thought patterns, reflexes. And that was done through incredible brutality. In the 20th century, between 13 and 15 million Ukrainians were killed or died in an unnatural death because of the wars and because of Soviet and Nazi totalitarianism. There was an artificial famine that Stalin created by requisitioning all the grain after the fall harvest in 1932, and probably at least 4 million people died on what is the most fertile land in the world. Then came World War II. The Holocaust occurred, a large part of the Holocaust occurred in Ukraine. So Ukrainian Jewry was almost eliminated. And this led people to develop reflexes of protection, a mask, a facade, a wall, because you can't trust the other. The other is dangerous. But there were some people who resisted this totalitarian control and maintained the faith and church life in the underground, clandestinely. All churches were taken away, all buildings, and the leadership was all arrested and spent years in Siberia. After Stalin died, some of these people were allowed to return, but the bishops worked as ambulance drivers or coal stokers. The result of half a century of world war and totalitarianism was that the number of priests was reduced from 3,000 to 300 priests, average age 70. So in a country where the average life expectancy of males was 65, this cohort was about to disappear. And the number of people these 300 priests could minister to, let's say 100 each, but that's a maximum estimate, is 30,000. So out of 4 million, only 30,000, less than 1%, had regular access to the life of the church. And that was the situation until the late 80s. And it just goes to show that around Jesus, there were not many. In the first centuries of Christianity, there were not many members of the church. And in the 20th century, this church was reduced by 90% in terms of clergy and 99% in terms of active laity. And then freedom came. Freedom came without a war, without, a bloody revolution. And people hearkened back to the tradition. This is why tradition is so important. This is why memory is so important. This is why manuscripts are so important. And there was still a living memory, because the oldest generation had been formed in the 30s when the church was still free. And they tried to preserve something, maybe prayer, if not, connection with the underground in the home. And we saw a remarkable revival. Now, 30 years later, those 300 priests are 3,000. There are 800 seminarians in our church for about 5 million people. That's the Catholic population of Southern California, if you could imagine that it has 800 seminarians. And we are now being hit by global trends, the popular culture of the 21st century, secularization, materialism. So the number of vocations are declining. There were four candidates for every spot in the seminaries in the early 1990s. Now it's about 0.8 candidates for every spot. So the seminaries are practically quite full. But the church that weathered and survived and overcame totalitarianism now is confronted with the challenges of the global church, and they are not easy.
So the distinctive aspect of the Ukrainian Catholic tradition is communion with Rome. And you spoke earlier of the fact that your parents came from a region that was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then it was Poland, then it's occupied by the Germans, then it's the Soviet Union. Could you say just a word back in time, since you're an expert in it, how the Ukrainian Catholic Church came to be in the first place? And I think that gives people background for why it became caught during the Soviet period.
Well, Ukrainian Catholics hearken back, they draw their lineage back to the beginnings of Christianity in Ukraine. There are probably centuries of presence of Christian presence in Ukraine in 9th, 10th century. But the traditional date for kind of the big beginning is 988, when the Grand Prince of Kiev accepted Christianity in the Byzantine form from missionaries from Constantinople. That is before the Great Schism, the schism between East and West, so that it's hard to say that that was, what he accepted Orthodoxy. He accepted Christianity in the Byzantine form.
Mm-hmm.
Being a daughter church of Byzantium, over centuries, the daughter was influenced by the argument of her mother and her aunt, Constantinople and Rome. The daughter was not the creator of the dispute, but since it was in jurisdictional subordination to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, as Rome and Constantinople drifted apart, the church in Ukraine came to be known as Orthodox. Although in Ukraine, and this is something very specific about Ukraine and Belarus as opposed to Russia, there was never a strong anti-Latin tradition of theological polemic. During the Council of Florence, the Metropolitan of Kiev, who was a Greek from Byzantium, signed the Union of Florence and came back and promulgated it. But he was arrested by the Muscovites when he went to Muscovite territory, Russian territory.
We should just add for our listeners, that's 15th century. Is that?
We're talking about the 15th century, right?
Is it 1439, the council?
1439 is the council, the end of the Council of Florence, when there was a union declared between East and West, because this is a great scandal that we're divided. The Lord said, be one like the Father and I are one. Those were his most passionate words in the Garden of Gethsemane with it before the Last Supper, after the Last Supper. These are the things the Lord was most focused on. And so this desire for union is something that reoccurred in this Eastern church in Ukraine. And during the Protestant Reformation, when through printing, there was a communications revolution very similar to the computer revolution that we lived through in the last 2 generations. There was a dissemination of questions, new modern questions were emerging. And the leadership of the, let's say, Orthodox Church in Ukraine turned to Constantinople to help respond to the challenges of both the Protestants, but also the resurgent Catholic Counter-Reformation. Mm-hmm. And it's I have a 400-page answer to this question in my book.
I know you do.
Encapsulate it. Basically, the leadership of the church, including the Metropolitan, decided to seek communion with Rome. And I believe that this was a pastoral response, a desire to find answers to questions and to overcome this disunion, which is scandalous. It wasn't accepted by everybody. In fact, many in the nobility particularly, and a few of the bishops rejected this union. So what happened is this church split. And that's why you have the Eastern Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And Ukrainian Catholics are descendants from those who accepted the union. But we see ourselves in direct continuity with the Church of Kiev. And now the head of our church is in Kiev.
Mhm.
And it was actually the Metropolitan of Kiev who was head of the church when the union was made.
So this is, I mean, this is such a fascinating story, and it also explains why Western Ukraine is such a bastion for your tradition, because that is obviously part of the Slavic world that was engaged with the West in all kinds of ways and would have been more aware of things like the Reformation, the efforts of the Catholic Church to reform itself in response to the Reformation. And I also know Western Ukraine was a very important center of early printing in Slavonic, and many of those fabulous old books are in libraries and archives in Lviv and elsewhere. So I'd like to turn briefly to a library and then use that as a way to ask another question about the 20th century. So our current project in Lviv is at the Andrey Sztitsky Library. And I'll be asking about him in just a moment. He was a towering figure in the early 20th century, or the first half of the 20th century, really, in the Ukrainian Catholic Church. We're delighted to be digitizing that collection because it shows the breadth of the man and his learning. But like all of the other historic collections in Ukraine, it's in a state institution now. This is part of the thoroughness of the Soviet repression of not only church libraries, monastic libraries, but also important private collections like Count Osolensky and other important libraries in Western Ukraine. So in that library, we see the text, both manuscript and printed, that shaped the intellect of this great figure. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Metropolitan Andrey Sztitsky and how, in a way, he laid a foundation that Cardinal Sztitsky and then the Resurgent Church were able to build upon.
I think Sztitsky was probably one of the greatest Christian churchmen of the 20th century. I think he's the greatest Ukrainian of the 20th century across the board. He was a giant. He was 6'6" tall. He was born in 1865. By today's standards, his family were billionaires. They were great landowners. And in his family, there were bishops for many centuries in the Eastern Rite. What happened in the 19th century is, because of the Polish cultural dominance in Western Ukraine, his family became Polonized. And that meant moving from the Eastern Rite to the Western Rite. Their estate in Western Ukraine, they had land holdings in various areas, but where he was born and raised was surrounded by Ukrainian villagers. They spoke Polish at home. His studies were in French. He had an excellent classical education. During World War II, he translated Plato's Symposium for the priests as part of a retreat during the war. He also translated St. Basil from Greek into Ukrainian. But he had mystical experiences, a deep prayer life. Both of his parents were pious. His mother was very religious. And he felt a special calling to go back to the roots of his family and become Eastern Catholic. This was seen as a scandal in Polish society. The scion of this great Sztitsky family, his brother, for example, became a famous Polish army general. And Sztitsky's father did everything to keep him from doing so. He forced him to first get a law degree before he went to the monastery. Actually, the Pope got involved to give him a blessing for this. This is how famous this cause was. And he ended up becoming a Basilian monk. He did doctorates also in philosophy and theology. At that time, doctorates were more modest. So he had law studies, philosophical studies, and theological studies. He had an excellent education. He knew German because he grew up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, French was the language with which they corresponded in the family to each other. They wrote letters to each other in French. He eventually learned English. Well, of course, his Latin was excellent, and he learned Greek as well as Church Slavonic. So he was an abbot very soon in the monastery, initiating a journal, a missionary journal that the monastery published. And then the Holy See nominated him actually the Austrian authorities had a big role in this, nominated him bishop of Stanislaviv. He was 34 years old. The next year, at 35, he was moved to become Archbishop of Lviv, basically the head of this church that, as I told you earlier, it had only 3 dioceses then. And he was the head of this church from 1901 to his death in 1944. In that interim, there were 7 different governments, 7 different countries in Lviv. You had Austria, then you had a Russian occupation, then you had Ukrainian independence, then you had interwar Poland, then there were the Soviets, the Nazis, and the Soviets again. Sztitsky used all of his spiritual, intellectual, and material resources to work for the social, intellectual, and spiritual development of the people he was responsible for. He was a great ecumenist. He learned Hebrew and spoke Hebrew with Jews. He harbored Jews in his palace during the Holocaust and gave a command that monasteries do the same. And hundreds of Jews were saved through this network. Some of them are still alive today, living even in the United States. And he developed an enormous range of social activity: scouts, hospitals, orphanages, the museum that has this library, icon collections. And he started developing a university by establishing a theological faculty. That's the university that I ended up working in. The Ukrainian Catholic University is the child of the seeds that he sowed. Since the Soviets were already in Lviv in 1944 when he died, for the next half century, they tried to blacken his legacy. And it's only now in the last 30 years that the real richness of his life and work and his spiritual kind of depth is being discovered by the world.
So this is fascinating because in the eyes of his parents, he was taking a step backwards culturally by becoming.
He was going to they were considered the We Got Rhythm people. They know how to sing and dance, but not high culture, and they're peasants in the fields, not in the cities. And he went down like our Lord went down.
But for him, it was a matter of re-entering the great tradition. And that's evident in what you were just describing about his learning. And so that makes the work with this library fascinating, because I can't wait to see what's in there when we look at those manuscripts and eventually put them online, which will be a great memorial, I think, to his significance.
Well, you're doing what he was doing. He collected these manuscripts. He sent out the professors of the academy, the seminarians, to the churches to find, old books that were not being used, or icons that were being stored in, the attics of churches because they were considered old and people wanted new ones, shiny ones. So he collected the greatest icon collection in Ukraine. And this manuscript collection, but also old printed books. Inkunabula, well, actually, there weren't many Slavic Inkunabula because that's before 1500, but I think 16th and 17th, 18th century.
I think we stretch it a century for Slavic books.
Okay,
So we have,
great.
for example, in our collection, we do have a copy of the Ostrog Bible,
Yeah.
which is a monument of early printing in Slavonic.
And it was actually state-of-the-art biblical editing, redaction being done then. It was a very fine piece of putting together the manuscript tradition and synthesizing a text for the printed version.
Mm-hmm. No, it's an extraordinary book. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Lviv because it's come up so frequently already in our conversation, and I was amazed my first and subsequent visits there because the city is really a kind of living palimpsest with all of those layers of culture. I remember walking down a street and somebody had uncovered, like a stenciling in Yiddish from one of the old Jewish shops that was there at some point, long gone with the destruction of that community. The great Polish cathedral with just a handful of worshipers because it's no longer a Polish city. The Austro-Hungarian style architecture, which makes it such a charming town. And then this, incredibly painful and bloody history of the 20th century. So in a way, it's almost a kind of symbol of much of what you've described today about traditions caught between two different worlds, about the way things evolve and develop. So that takes us to the significance, I think, of UKU, the Ukrainian Catholic University, where you were very involved, really the one who brought it to its current state of development and were rector for many years. Could you say a little bit about what the goal of establishing a Catholic university in Western Ukraine really was?
There was this opportunity to reflect carefully on what kind of a university is needed. The head of the church, Cardinal Slipy's successor, Miroslav Ivan Lubachevsky, asked me to develop a university, get people together, get a committee together. We don't have land, we don't have money, we don't have books. You start with theology. There's no theologians, 52 million people in the country, but not a single theologian with a university level degree. Even the language theologically is stunted because for most of the 20th century, it couldn't be used for theology. So we took 2 years to do a feasibility study before we started. We took models from 10 different countries and asked the question, what kind of university does Ukraine need? A Ukraine that is post-communist, post-modern, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional. And one of the things that we set at the heart of it was going back to tradition, an ad fontes approach. And our theological students, who were the first students, because that was the first faculty of this school, had all 3 years of Greek, something that no theology program has, 2 years of Latin, a year of Church Slavonic, 4 years of English, and 2 years of another foreign language to get to sources, to read texts. But the two kind of ideals or pillars that we built on were what we call the two M's. One is the martyr legacy, the martyrs, those who withstood totalitarianism. They met the biggest challenge of the 20th century, so they can teach us how to encounter the challenges of the 21st. And the second is the marginalized. Who is the most marginalized usually in an intellectual setting? I was a student and a friend of Henry Nouwen, who brought me into the world of L'Arche. And as we were doing this feasibility study, Henry was visiting us in Ukraine in 1993 and 94. And from the Harvard years and my visits to the Daybreak community in Toronto and Henry's visits, we came to a conclusion to put mentally handicapped people at the center of this university that has high intellectual aspirations because of the trauma of totalitarianism. A system that kills systematically led people to develop reflexes of protection, of hiding, of really questioning the other, which means you don't trust. if you don't trust in family, in society, in business, in politics, things don't work well. And they don't work well in Ukraine. We can see there's much convulsion because there is this lack of fundamental trust. Bringing the handicapped people into the university was our response to this great post-traumatic challenge, because our friends with mental handicaps with special needs, they have special gifts. They just want to know, can you trust me? Can you love me? And they've become tutors of human relations in this university. So putting together the ad fontes approach, which comes, as we talked about, from Sztitsky, from Sleepy, the martyrdom of the church, and the marginalized, bringing the margins into the center. The formula for this university was created. Today, it has the highest SAT incoming scores of students, significantly above the next university, is the giant nationally funded university in the capital of the country, which means the most talented students in Ukraine want to study at this school. And of course, they're not all Catholic, but we try to make a clear, charitable, creative proposal of the gospel, introducing students to tradition, which is also, why manuscripts and the kind of work that you do so important to the Ukrainian Catholic University.
Well, it's no surprise that in a way you were our anchor there, because we could deal with a modern, successful, prospering, and dare I say it, honest institution. And I know that one of the challenges in post-Soviet Ukraine, another legacy of totalitarianism, is endemic corruption. And people have told me that employers and others in Ukraine know that if somebody gets a degree from UKU, it's a real degree. They really have had the kind of education you described, and that you can trust it, and that they will perform well.
Yes, I often say there's apparently no corruption in UKU yet. You have to be vigilant because the circumstances are such that this is a way of life. And it's in one sense understandable, because the system, the legal system, was so unjust, so mortifying, that working against the system was a survival mechanism. And now trusting in laws and trusting the police and trusting the tax collectors, et cetera, is not easy for many people.
Indeed. Another way that you may overthrow a government or a system, but its legacy endures for even generations.
Yes.
And you're trying to do something about that. So let's turn then to the challenge of hope, and that's a good place to turn our conversation in that direction. So you've got challenges working as a bishop with a diaspora community. You've got an aging community, as many of us do, in Christian churches in the West. You're dealing with changing culture, modernity, all of these intractable dilemmas that face somebody in church leadership. Where do you find hope?
Well, our hope can only be in the Lord and in His witness. I've reflected upon this a lot. And it is not only an abstract intellectual, reflection, but I lived it. I had a chance to be a student in what was called the Ukrainian Catholic University in Rome, a prototype created by Joseph Sleepy. In Italy, there were only 300 Ukrainians at that time. Now there's 500,000. But he created a university there. And a lot of people thought this was, bombastic and not serious. But he was saying we're creating a prototype, and it needs to be a seed. There were only 11 of us students when I went there. I mean, that's a hopeless proposition. I was a seminarian for a country I couldn't get to. I later, in the late 80s, met an underground that was the last remnant. It was dying out. It had a totalitarian superpower armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, crushing it. what chance did it have? What chance did Peter have? A poor fisherman, no degrees, not all, and he didn't even know Latin well. What chance did Peter have in Rome? I asked myself in St. Peter's Basilica, the humongous monument to this man that had zero chance. We are followers of a great loser. Jesus was a loser according to the criteria of the world. He lost everything. He gave up everything. And I think we really need to own that, to own the Paschal mystery, to own Jesus's coming down, his condescension, his dropping off, the glory of heavenly life with the Father and the Holy Spirit, and descend to where we are poor, where we are sinners. It is God's body. Right now, so many churches are closing. And in so many of our churches, there are so few people, especially during COVID. But we have to remember the church is not a building. Yes, it might have buildings, but in different circumstances, as you know, the church didn't have buildings. I had a chance to be part of that church experience that didn't have buildings in the late 1980s in the Soviet underground. And then we spent the last 25 years studying it. We did interviews with these people, over 2,000 full-length interviews, life stories, to document this underground history, because people, of course, hid every trace of their activity. And I've become convinced through this experience and this study that the Lord is only beginning. I think that 20,000 years from now, I am hoping they will write a history of the church and say, at the end of primitive Christianity, the year 2000, there was the first attempt to wipe out the church somewhere. And a few people stood up and said no by saying yes to the Lord. And that's really when Christianity started to flourish, in the third millennium, in the fourth millennium. The church is very young. It's only 2,000 years old. We know how old the universe is, or there's speculation, This church is just beginning. It is the church of our Savior. It's the church of God who loves us, who gave his son for us. And the gates of hell will not prevail against it.
I love that perspective on time, because it makes me rethink all of these manuscripts we've digitized, which we think of as, these sort of monuments to the past and, the heights of thought, reflection, scholarship, and so on. And from your perspective, it's more like, these are kind of the initial scribblings of people who are in the early stages of working out what it means to be, whether that be the history of the Christian church or, starting a few centuries after us, Islam, even the history of the Jews, from the perspective you described, isn't that long. And there's a lot more to come. So from that perspective, if we take that kind of view, what do you think is the significance of cultural preservation, the kind of work that we do with manuscripts? Why does that matter? Why is that important?
I think COVID is helping us address this a little bit, but we have lived through a period of incredible cultural, chronological hubris, thinking, we've made it, we've got computers, we, get things instantly. We put a man on the moon. Before, people were really primitive. They really didn't understand. We have come to understand things. Well, I think it's really not the case. The progress in medical technology and in computerization and transport, that is undeniable, and I'm the first one to take advantage of it. But if we listen to the past if we read the manuscripts, if we look at the art, we see that there was incredible depth in the life of our ancestors. Will the architecture of today stand up as a model of beauty, as do, you know, the cathedrals or even the pyramids? I believe that there is no period that has a monopoly on the virtues or the vices. The human experience is lived and is alive constantly. I don't think there's a golden age of humanity. We are all in our here and now faced with the human challenges that are conditioned by the culture that we live in. And, you know, in all societies, at least until recently, there was always a great respect for the elders, the older people, the grandparents, because they had lived through something, they had experienced something, and they could share that. When we look at manuscripts, when we look at the cultural experience of the past, we can say, hey, this was really profound. This really rings true. We can also say, no, this was wrong. This was unjust. For example, slavery. So there are many things that, you know, we find it difficult today to sit down and look each other in the eye and enjoy a meal together without a screen in our face, without interruption. People used to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
They, you know, used to be able to be together as a family. They used to be able to make homemade pasta. Everybody did. I'm not saying, you know, we should nostalgically look to the past and live it today, but we should learn from it. Mm-hmm. We should respect it. And if we do, I think we will be enriched in a very deep way.
Well, that's a fantastic place, I think, for us to close this interview. And I think my takeaway really is going to be that we're only 2,000 years old in the Christian tradition. And then, you know, compare that to other religions, which may be slightly older, slightly younger, but we're all still tyros. We're all still beginning this. Because so often we do speak of the manuscripts that we preserve as voices of the past. And instead, I should be thinking of them as the voices of near contemporaries who, as you say, got some things wrong. We can learn from their mistakes as well as their wisdom, but we should keep them really as living witnesses, not simply as something that's old and dusty and to be put on a shelf. So with that, Borys, I think I'll thank you for this interview. And I want to encourage our audience to share this with friends and anyone you think might be interested. It will be on YouTube, available for you to share. Those of you who are watching this premiere online will be receiving one of the inevitable follow-up surveys that we ask you to complete, because we do take feedback seriously, and it has helped shape the second episode of the series. And finally, we'll be back on May 20th with episode 3. We'll be in the Middle East, and we'll surprise you later with more details. So thank you, Archbishop Borys. It's a great pleasure to be reunited with you in the way we do it these days on Zoom. And I wish you every good thing and blessing in your ministry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Columba. And please give my warmest regards to all members of the team. Your work is monumental.
Thank you.